the Trump family almost considered him a part of that family. You know, Donald Trump said he was like a son to him. Don Jr. said he was like a brother to him. And that just shows kind of the level of influence and proximity he had to people in power.
Hello and welcome to The President's Path. I'm here with Courtney Subramanian and Bernd Boozman, and we're doing the episode live this week. It's Friday evening here on the East Coast of the US, and we're doing this episode live because it has been a dramatic, shocking, tragic week in this country, and there's a lot to discuss here on this pod, just as there's a lot to discuss and debate right across this country at the moment, because of course this week we had what the governor of Utah called a political assassination. The killing of the massive conservative leader, online social media influencer, friend of the president and vice president, Charlie Kirk. At the centre of all of this, of course, a young man, just 31, leaving behind a young wife and 2 tiny children and millions of grieving supporters. And Bernd and Courtney, it really feels like it's one of those where were you when you heard the news, big historic moments that people will talk about in the history of this country for many, many years to come. Bernd, you were in the White House. What was it like at that moment?
Well, the way I actually personally found out about it was I was in the upper press area of the White House where Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt has her offices, as does Stephen Chung, the Director of Communications. And just to my left, a young woman saw the news on her phone, and there was kind of an audible gasp when she said, "Oh my God, Charlie Kirk has been shot," and then got up and scurried out of the room. And, you know, over the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour, many people in the White House were really very, very emotional. We saw kind of messages of thoughts and prayers come from many, many officials in the White House. And I think it's kind of indicative that, you know, from the president on downwards, many of people that work in the White House had a very personal relationship with Charlie Kirk. They saw him not just for the political benefit of it, but they really considered him a friend. And even, you know, the younger staff at the White House, many of them are just out of university, and that demographic of young conservatives is exactly the sort of people that Charlie Kirk was speaking to in large part. And it really was kind of, there was a sense of shock and grief in the White House that was very, very, it could be felt very strongly.
I mean, I was in the newsroom here and, you know, the news came through, Charlie Kirk has been shot, and immediately it was, you know, regardless at that point of what his injuries were going to be like, it was already going to be massive news that someone like him doing what he does, engaging in conversations and debates at universities, that there would be shots fired in that in and of itself was a huge issue, a huge story. And then, of course, as time progressed and we saw how serious this was and what a critical condition he was in, and sadly later went on to die, it just became a story that really dominated here. You know, I dashed into the studio here and we were in rolling news coverage like every other network was for many, many hours to come. I mean, Courtney, it's hard to oversell really just what a big person Charlie Kirk was in this country, and particularly within the conservative movement.
Yeah, I mean, down to the fact that his death was even announced first by Donald Trump on social media, right? This is a guy who was a close ally of the president, had the ear of really all the most powerful Republicans in the party. He, you know, had started this youth organization as an 18-year-old. And amassed just a massive following. I mean, just looking at some of the numbers, they had more than 850 chapters across college campuses, and they brought in $85 million in revenue last year. So this is somebody who had both, you know, political but also cultural influence on the Republican Party and the young Republican movement. And again, just I cannot overstate, excuse me, how important he was to Donald Trump and the people around Donald Trump.
I mean, outside of Donald Trump, he probably was the best known person in the conservative, the right movement, the MAGA movement, really.
I think very, very much so. After he passed away, there was a phone interview with Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, and she said that explicitly, that in her mind, he was perhaps the best known person of this movement that's not in government today. And after he died, I was exchanging messages with some younger Republicans, and many of them said that he kind of was their inspiration to kind of get started in politics. The prevailing feeling for many of them was that university campuses were overwhelmingly left, and he created this movement that allowed them to be more open and kind of engage in politics in a way that they hadn't before. And I think for the Trump White House, that really can't be understated how important that was in terms of motivating those young people, who many of whom perhaps voted for the first time in one of Donald Trump's elections, or perhaps weren't really engaged before. And he really was kind of a spark for many of those young people.
And actually,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go on, Courtney.
No, I just to add to Byrne's point, I mean, he played a massive role on the Trump campaign's Get Out the Vote effort in 2024. The president performed much better with younger voters, and he credits that largely to Charlie Kirk and the work that his organization did for the party. They spent tens of millions of dollars. And, actually one survey by TikTok found after the election that Trump voters under 30 trusted him most on that platform. And so I think that just speaks to, again, the influence he had on this voting bloc.
Speaking to people who aren't in America in the last few days, and maybe they've heard of Charlie Kirk if they're of a younger age themselves, because clips of him would come up on their feeds in other countries because he was so masterful in terms of turning content from some of his interactions into things on his feeds. But they've been asking me, why is this such a big deal in the US? Who is this person? Why is the president ordering flags to be flown at half-mast and saying he'd go to his funeral? And there isn't really a comparable person to Charlie Kirk in many other countries in the political world, because he wasn't elected, but he had this huge constituency of millions and millions and millions of people. And you see the post that J.D. Vance put up on X in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death. This long sort of laying out of his entire relationship with Charlie Kirk, and basically saying he wouldn't be vice president were it not for his interactions with Charlie Kirk. And we heard the president talking about that, as you've been saying, Courtney, that he basically wouldn't be president, perhaps, were it not for Charlie Kirk's influence as well.
I think it's also...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Byrne.
I think it's also kind of unique in that, the Trump family almost considered him a part of that family. Donald Trump said he was like a son to him. Don Jr. said he was like a brother to him. And that just shows kind of the level of influence and proximity he had to people in power, which even other personalities, online personalities, podcasters, they might have a kind of working professional political relationship with him, but he was really kind of seen as someone who was almost beyond that. And it had gone since 2016, when he was still 22 years old, 23 years old. So I think the extent of those links is something that isn't replicated in the U.S. And I certainly can't think of any examples abroad when a young man has really ingratiated himself into government like that.
And it kind of goes to explain why we've seen this outpouring of commentary across all platforms, and on TV shows and on the steps of Capitol Hill as well, because he had this massive following. He was beloved by many, but as the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, put it today, young people loved him, young people also hated him. He was a very divisive person. And so a lot of what we've seen online has been, really quite disgusting, hasn't it, in terms of how in some quarters people are celebrating the death of an individual, and then the arguments that are coming back. There's a lot of very divisive commentary that doesn't seem to be getting a lid put on it, despite the calls for calm that we've seen from many quarters.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because, again, of course, we're talking about a young man who lost his life to political violence and left behind a wife and two young kids. But I think multiple things can be true, right? This is somebody who conservatives praise as being a champion of their movement, of, helping bring, fill the enthusiasm gap among young voters. But, again, he also wasn't popular with those on the left, those he wasn't, necessarily aligned with ideologically. And he challenged a lot of their beliefs and criticized Democrats who saw him as somebody who fomented some of the toxic partisan landscape that we currently find ourselves in. And I think this, the divisions over his death sort of speaks to the moment we're in. And both parties, Democrats and Republicans, hold these sort of exaggerated ideas about how much their rivals tolerate violence, when in fact both sides really, mostly denounce it. And that sort of leads to some of the misperceptions that we're seeing.
I also think that that approach, to a certain extent, of kind of it was very unique in that most of his events were as was the one in Utah, in which he kind of challenged people to their beliefs, and I think that particular approach really kind of made him popular with President Trump and people in President Trump's team in that creating those viral moments and generating controversy ultimately was beneficial. And it's approach that Donald Trump has taken in his own way on social media and before, in terms of generating controversy and generating a conversation and viral clips and viral moments. I think that really endeared him to the president.
Mm. And you can see people coming from a real place of grief with some of what's been posted as well, though, those awful remarks we mentioned a few moments ago, but then you had the responses coming back of people declaring war, was the word being used, on Democrats. Thinking of Congresswoman Nancy Mace saying the Democrats own this, and all of these remarks sort of being made before even we had known the identity of the suspect in this case. It just, it speaks to a place where discussion in this country has become so polarized that the first place that people go to is a very incendiary one.
Yeah, I worry about how much this will exacerbate that, right? I mean, this typically is a moment where, you have some sort of unity, everyone calling for calm, everybody, denouncing this. And I think that of course, we've seen some Republicans pointing to corners of the internet where people are celebrating this. But I think that is some of the extremism of social media. You can find people being ungracious in parts of the internet. But I think if you look at, the leaders of the Democratic Party, they came out and denounced this right away. I don't think anyone agrees that this is the way to conduct themselves in politics, anyone in a leadership role for that matter. But unfortunately, I think this is the problem is, the question is, where do we go from here? How is this terrible tragedy used? How is it framed by each side? And what happens next, right?
I also think that to a certain extent, the kind of more positive, unifying remarks that have been made in the last 2 days, they've been kind of drowned out just simply by the volume of social media. For example, in at least 2 states, organizations of young Republicans and young Democrats put out joint statements saying this is a time for unity, this isn't a time to argue or bicker. But just because of the massive amounts of things that were being put out on social media, that was kind of drowned out of the conversation, at least in the initial 48 hours. And there was very few kind of senior politicians that provided that moderating voice. I think the one standout there was Governor Spencer Cox in Utah, who in his speech, explicitly said that this isn't a time to divide further, it's a time to unify. But then again, he's always been a very moderate in his own party, considered very moderate, and he's also someone who's for a very long time now made kind of a campaign of disagreeing better. We've seen him in the past with Democratic governors before, but there really hasn't been any very senior figures like him that have come out and called for unity on a national stage like that.
We've seen actually a sort of arc in a way of the comments from President Trump himself, haven't we? I mean, those first remarks that he made that video message from the Oval Office sitting at the desk, and he's talking about the radical left, and he's talking about, seeking out the perpetrators of this and anyone else who, activist judges he mentions as well. Quite what's been described as inflammatory language from the president. And then you take it forward to Friday morning, and he's doing an interview on Fox News, on Fox and Friends, and then he's calling for, let's talk about this, let's definitely keep this in the non-violent space. That's what Charlie Kirk stood for. He stood for discussion and for debate, but definitely a different tone again to what we're hearing from Governor Cox, as you're saying, Bernd. I mean, I wonder how realistic what Governor Cox is calling for actually is in a practical sense here. What do you think, Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we have a little bit of, we're missing that sort of consoler in chief from President Trump. As you said, the comments, he's really signaled that, this is something that is happening on the left, and that it is with Republican victims or Republican targets. He's not framing this that a string of political violence has happened to both Democrats and Republicans alike. And of course, that is true, right? We saw the murder of a Minnesota state Democrat a couple months ago. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania's house was set on fire. We had the assassination attempts on President Trump's life. And Nancy Pelosi, even a couple of years ago, someone broke into her San Francisco home and, wielded a hammer and severely injured her husband. So this isn't something that is, an issue for one party. It is a bipartisan issue. But again, we don't have the president sort of stepping in and being that unifier. And it does make me wonder, his framing, what cues Republicans will take from this, or how the White House will use this as part of a larger campaign or effort. Of course, we just don't know. And I should underline that we still don't have a motive. They did announce the name of a suspect they have in custody, but we still know nothing about why this happened and why this tragedy occurred. So there's a lot of questions still left to be answered, but I think it is a very fraught moment for the country. Certainly, a lot of people are watching, and it's a bit of a tinderbox.
I think in retrospect, once emotions die down a little bit, I think in retrospect, many people will point to the fact that President Trump almost reflexively blamed the radical left lunatics before there was even a suspect in custody as being kind of indicative of a wider problem here. And I was just looking at some polls before we started recording. And while the number of people who think political violence is fine is still actually very, very small in this country, there's a perception on both sides that the other side is willing to use political violence. And I think that kind of creates a climate of fear and of otherism almost, in which these sorts of incidents, it becomes very possible that people become radicalized online, or people become angry at the other side for what they see as some perceived injustice or a perceived willingness to use violence. And then it becomes very dangerous, because it really only takes one person to cause these sorts of national tragedies.
Well, and that's exactly what we've seen this week, insofar as we know it at this point anyway. I mean, the authorities saying they're not looking for anyone else in connection with the killing of Charlie Kirk, that they have that one individual in custody, and they expect to bring charges sometime in the middle of next week. But just speaking to some members of Congress and some senators, and indeed just people involved in public life in this country, unfortunately death threats and threats of violence have become something that people have just had to live with. But speaking to them in the last few days, there is definitely an extra layer of fear now when something that would have been considered low risk, a gathering of students on a university campus with someone who does engage with those who don't agree with them, for that to have been turned into such a place of horror and terror, and apparently so easily as well, that a lot of people are now far more fearful than they were for their lives. I mean, we've seen that already, haven't we? The cancellation of some events that were due to happen in the last few days here in the US, things moving from outside to inside, making the number of people attending to be smaller than originally planned. Even the president, his remarks, Bernd, you were there at the Pentagon to mark 9/11. The location there was changed out of, I think, an abundance of caution was the term used by the White House.
You know, that's a concern for people on both sides of the political argument, that this kind of becomes a new normal in which there's a heightened sense of fear that something might happen. You know, I think also, you know, given that these sorts of incidents tend to increase. I mean, the FBI's own statistics show that, you know, incidents of political violence or threats of political violence kind of tick upwards in election periods. I think there's a very real concern that the midterms or the next presidential election, that this is just a normal part of the discourse and that people are concerned about their safety. I think we already began to see this way before the incident in Utah. I mean, after the shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania, for example, that this is somehow that some part of American politics now. And I think that's a very significant concern for people going forward.
And it's incredibly personal. I mean, obviously for the president, you can't imagine what must have been going through his mind this week when he heard about Charlie Kirk, not just because he's a friend, but because of his own personal experience. But I mean, if we're talking about who's the great unifier, and if that perhaps is not the president, is there anyone on the Democratic side? I mean, there doesn't seem to be anyone stepping up, making those remarks either, does there?
Yeah, I think this comes at a terrible moment for the Democrats, who are grappling with the void that has been left by the 2024 election, not having, you know, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris as this sort of standard bearer, leader of the party. So there, as you said, there is no one really stepping up in this moment to serve that purpose or be that voice for the party. And it's left them, you know, in this moment where you have multiple people who are, you know, with their eye towards 2028 issuing statements, but no one really pulling the party together or, you know, working with the Republicans to try and lower the temperature.
Well, we're almost out of time, but we'll just mention very briefly the other big story that our UK-based colleagues here at the BBC have been focusing on as well, of course, is the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk. But the second state visit of Donald Trump to the UK, we'll have lots of coverage of that everywhere next week. I'm sure we'll be talking about it on the pod as well. But it's happening now without a British ambassador to the US in place following the sacking of Lord Peter Mandelson because of his links to Jeffrey Epstein. Just briefly, I mean, what do you guys think this is going to mean for the visit, for President Trump himself?
I think it creates a possibility for some very awkward moments and some very awkward questions, in that President Trump has tried so hard to move past this Epstein story. And then there's a British ambassador who's essentially out of the picture now because he was part of these same documents in which President Trump, the documents alleged to be from President Trump are. And I just think it creates a lot of awkwardness and a lot of possibility for very hard questions when he gets there.
Yeah, I think it's very much the elephant in the room that's following him across the ocean. But you know, I think the British embassy here has done its best to try and tamp down on this story carrying over to the next news cycle when we see the president over in the UK. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see who steps in at that moment. But it certainly will be the elephant in the room.
Well, I can tell you it is still a huge story in the UK, so it won't be an elephant as so much a big sign, I think, in many of those rooms. I'm sure it'll be among the questions that our colleagues who are covering this on the ground from the BBC and elsewhere will be keen to ask the President about and the Prime Minister about. So we'll see how that pans out. As I say, we'll have lots of coverage across all our platforms, and I'm sure we'll be debriefing it here on this show next week as well. Courtney, Bernd, talk to you next week. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.